Data East. They were one of the game makers in the 1980s and 90s that put out a ton of classic arcade games that made their name really mean something when you saw it on the side of the cabinet. From the likes of Burger Time, Bad Dudes, RoboCop, and Night Slashers, they were a staple of my arcade visits as a kid. Like most companies back then, they also made games for consoles, and in this episode we will be looking at the wares they put out on Sega's Genesis. Every game here was either developed or published by Data East. I've got over a dozen titles to get through, so let's get started. In 1991, Data East published a port of their arcade run-and-gun hit, Midnight Resistance. It was developed by Intelligent System Corporation and Opera House, two companies that would go on to port a few more games for Data East. The visuals take a solid hit in color and detail, but remain overall faithful. It's much darker and the animations have been cut back quite a bit as well. The gameplay has a variety of options depending on how you like to play. You can simply fire in the direction you are facing and aiming, or you can switch off to a button that rotates your gun so you can shoot and move independently. While the visuals were indeed pared back, the audio has seen a massive upgrade here. I adore this soundtrack, and frankly, it's some of the best music the hardware ever produced in my eyes. The real problem with this one was the lack of two-player co-op. The arcade had it, and it was stripped away here completely. Part of the fun of these games were playing with your friends, and with so many other Genesis titles retaining their multiplayer modes, it was sorely missed. In 1991, Data East teamed up with Telenet to release Vapor Trail Hyper Offense Formation, a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up that kinda puts you in mind of a faster Raiden trad. For you Saturn fans of the games Wolf Fang and Skull Fang, both those games were actually sequels to this, all three based on their original arcade counterparts. I like this game, and though it won't win any awards for originality or presentation, it does have some nice touches like great parallax effects and a jammin' soundtrack. A UK release was planned but never happened, leaving the only way to get this one was the Japanese and US variants. It retains its two-player mode and still has multiple ships to choose from, making it a very decent overall port. It tends to be quite expensive these days, with complete in-box listings going over $100, no matter the region. (1992) brought us a home port of the Data East arcade game Too Crude, renamed Too Crude Dudes for the US and Europe. Aside from the expected cutbacks in color, sprite size, and animation, this is actually fairly accurate overall in terms of content and gameplay. It holds on to the two-player co-op, and you can still use just about everything in the play area as a weapon. The gameplay reminds me sort of a futuristic Kung Fu Master, where you play on a single plane as enemy drones simply careen towards you endlessly. It's no Streets of Rage, of course, but you get a friend together on this one, and it can be still a good time. It kept the arcade name Crude Buster in Japan, and was developed by Intelligent System Corporation and Opera House. This was the only home port of this game at the time, though these days you can play the arcade original on the Data East Arcade Classics that was released for the Nintendo Wii in 2010. Also in 1992, Data East released a port of Chelnov called Atomic Runner in the US and Europe. This was an auto-scrolling run-and-gun about a scientist trying to rescue his sister from the evil Death Terrians. The screen never stops, and the challenge is amplified well beyond the one-hit deaths by having no control over the screen movement and by having to use a button to turn around and shoot. The mechanics here really are unique and doesn't really play like much of anything else. The visuals are pretty good considering the original arcade game was released in 1988, and there have been numerous changes to the layouts and art style to liven things up. The arcade version generated a bit of a ruckus in 1988 because the story had a Russian coal miner being blasted in a nuclear accident and emerging as superhuman, which was seen as a parody of the Chernobyl accident and taken as extremely bad taste. The Genesis version underwent a radical story change due to this and dropped the Chelnov name from the title. If you want something challenging and different, this can definitely fill the void. Intelligent System Corporation and Opera House were back again in 1992 with a port of the arcade classic Captain America and the Avengers, a side-scrolling beat-em-up starring some of Marvel's most popular comic book heroes. This was not a highly regarded game at the time of its release, but I don't find it so bad. It has two-player co-op, the music and sound samples are solid, and the overall stage design and gameplay is faithful. Of course, the arcade version annihilates it in most of these areas, including having a full 4-player co-op mode. This version also has some nasty sprite flicker in later levels that dampen the visuals quite a bit. Overall though, the massive boss battles and 2-player mode save it, and it still makes for a decent challenge. This could have been a lot better, I feel, especially considering how much better games like Streets of Rage 2 looked. Funnily enough, even though all the companies involved in making this game were Japanese, the one region it was never released in was Japan.
Avengers assemble! Help! Leave it to me!
Side Pocket was released in 1992 as well, an overhead billiards game that offers pockets, 9-ball, and trick gameplay modes. This game is as simple as games come. Knock the correct ball into the pocket and win. That's it. As you get better, you can even put a bit of English on the ball to get it to do just about anything you want, but I still suck at this game. I have a hard enough time just getting a straight shot in the pocket, much less anything involving something more difficult. The visuals are plain, the sound is much the same, and games like this just do not stand the test of time. If you loved it as a kid, it likely still holds some playability, but for the rest of you, this is a hard skip all the way around. Is it possible to hate a game before you ever play it? Well, when I saw 1993's Dashin Desperadoes, I hated it long before I ever put a card in my Genesis. The box art is plain disgusting, the worst of the worst in fact. It was so creepy my 18-year-old self was immediately repulsed by it, forever dooming my opinion of this game to negativity. The gameplay here consists of two cowboys having races to see who gets to Jenny first, the girl of their dreams who apparently vets her men on their speed and ability to avoid obstacles. I don't like much about this game at all. The visuals are average, the gameplay is annoying, and it has to be played in split screen even in single player. I did try it out a few times in competitive multiplayer and it's definitely better there, but I just don't see the appeal playing it alone. There's a reason it was only released in the United States, and it had little to do with the Old West theme. In 1994, Factor 5 did their awesome Mega Turrican for the Mega Drive. Sony picked it up for a European release, but Konami dropped its plans to do the same for the US market. Data East picked up the ball and ran with it, making sure this fantastic game got a shot to impress run-and-gun fans in North America. I've covered this game numerous times and you know what I think of it. It's a great looking, sounding, and playing game that did the hardware proud. Factor 5 showed what the Genesis was capable of when you actually had some skill with the hardware and just weren't looking for a quick and easy port from other platforms. It'll kick your ass and you'll keep coming back for more, just like a good game should. Even if you have to emulate it, do yourself a favor and try it. I'm confident many of you will come away impressed. This was never released in Japan. With Sonic moving millions of units on the Genesis, every company under the sun wanted a mascot game of their own. Data East moved into action and released High Seas Havoc in 1994. It was called just Havoc in Europe and Captain Lang in Japan, and it covers all the bases of your typical Sonic clone. It's got colorful graphics with lots of animations, it's got one-button gameplay that's easy to play, and of course it has an animal that looks like a human being, in this case a seal. You think that it's a great game, right? Not so fast. While it has many attributes similar to Sonic, it also has slippery gameplay that makes the hero feel like he's playing on ice a lot of the times, and the music fails to deliver anything close to a great audio experience. Add in bland enemies and stages, and you have a game that really does fall short. It isn't a terrible game by any means, it's just that the Genesis had so many of these types of games that are better, you have to ask yourself why even play it. If you do, you will find some decent boss enemies, and I dig some of the backgrounds, but if you want a better class of mascot-driven platformer, stick with Sega's. Many of you know that one of my favorite Sega arcade games was 1993's Outrunners. I had no illusions about the 1994 Genesis port even being close, but they messed it up in a big way. A lot of folks assume I hate this version because it wasn't arcade accurate. That simply isn't true. I hate this port because they utterly destroyed the feel of the arcade in every single way. The Genesis had no hardware level sprite scaling abilities, so expecting anything close to the arcade was foolish. But this port further destroys any chance of it playing like the arcade because of the split-screen graphics, which you are forced to play in no matter what. When the original Outrun was ported to the Genesis, it was choppier, but retained the overall look and feel of the arcade. I was expecting something along these lines with Outrunners, but instead, the locked split-screen mode further deteriorates the trackside details, makes the vehicle zoom into view literally 3 frames before you hit them, and just fails on every visual level to even look somewhat similar to the arcade. I genuinely understand wanting to preserve a multiplayer mode in a title like this, but my god did they shit the bed. The developers at Sega CS should have went the full screen, single player route without question. It would have been choppier, yes, but at least it could have retained some real resemblance to the gameplay that was infinitely superior to this atrocity. This is Outrunners in name only and should never ever be confused as a port of the incredible arcade original. Data East had to publish it because Sega wouldn't do it themselves outside of Japan, but not even those guys would touch it for a European release. In 1995, the Genesis got a port of Side Pocket 2 that was renamed Minnesota Fats Pull Legend. It looks and plays much the same as the first Genesis game, but now has a story mode where Minnesota Fats basically trash talks you until you beat all his lackeys and plays you himself. Then he basically runs the table on you and talks more trash about how much you suck. Copy and paste pretty much everything I said before. The Saturn got a version of this as well that looks and sounds better if you have any interest at all. The Genesis version was released only in the US. Data East was also responsible for a single Sega CD release, Panic, also known as Switch in Japan. In this one, a global computer virus has made the world go crazy, and it's your job to get through the various stages by pressing buttons, at random mind you, to see what happens. This is less a game and more like an interactive cartoon. The back of the box calls it a puzzle game, but it isn't really that either. Most of the entertainment value comes from the various scenes that play out once you hit the wrong button. Sometimes it's something silly, and sometimes it's something that actually kills the little on-screen dude. It can have some replay value if you aim to see all the different scenes, which the box claims is over 1,000 different ones. Being a fan of arcade games at the time, this was a bit too tame for my taste, but I do recommend you try it if you ever get a chance. My daughter found it humorous enough to play it for a lot longer than I could, and you may as well. Data East, like a lot of game makers back then, also licensed out some of their properties to other companies. In 1994, Takara published Joe and Mac, a port of the arcade game of the same name. It loses some color in the transition, but keeps the two-player mode. The US and Brazil got it, but Japan and Europe went without. Both Cobra Command and Road Avenger got ports to the Sega CD, which were originally Data East Laserdisc arcade games. Wolf Team took up the duties here for both ports. Cobra Command was called Thunderstorm, and Road Avenger was called Road Blaster in Japan. Gameplay was pretty much push the button or direction when prompted on screen, resulting in the video continuing to play. Do this well enough and you just might see the ending. They were some of the better full motion video releases on the platform. In 1990, Sega licensed and developed Darwin 4081 in-house themselves. This was based on Data East's arcade game Super Real Darwin, a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up that was a sequel to Darwin 4078. The name is derived from your ship's ability to collect power-ups and adapt its weapon system to current battle conditions. The graphics and sound are average, but it ain't bad for an early shoot-'em-up on the platform. It was only released in Japan and Korea. At the end of the day, Data East's presence on the Genesis and Mega Drive was kind of an overall letdown if you were a big fan of their arcade hits. Where was the Genesis version of Bloody Wolf? A home port of RoboCop? And man, would it have been cool to have a decent home port of Night Slashers. Sadly, by the late 1990s, the US division of Data East was closed down, and in the early 2000s, Data East as a whole was liquidated. Its properties were spread to various entities from there, and all that's left today is the legacy of a company that made some great arcade games 20 plus years ago. However things may have ended up, I always appreciated me a good Data East made game, and while they were never on the level of a Capcom or a Konami back then, they still did some great work that's very much worth revisiting today. These Genesis games range in quality as well, but again, some of these are still very much worth playing now. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.